morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am Sue Prey. I am the chaplain of Southwest General Hospice. I also do, forgot. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I also do a fair amount of work with people who are in bereavement and grief, and I've been doing that long before I was a chaplain. So this is kind of my passion, actually. Ministry is my second career, and when I went back to seminary, I was very intentional with the idea of being a chaplain, and also with a focus on grief and loss, and much of my coursework was in pastoral care. Actually, my concentration is in chaplaincy, and I spent a lot of time with courses in death and dying and corpse work. It was pretty amazing. But not for everyone. So that's just a little about me. I was a pastor at Middleburg Heights Community United Church of Christ for a couple of years until COVID released us to do bedside care, and I was able to finally get into some chaplaincy work, which is my love. So today we're going to talk about grief. We're going to do that for 2 Sundays. First, an understanding of grief, what it is, and how we sort of misunderstand it in our culture. That to set the foundation for what's more important, how to care for ourselves and how to care for each other during our grief. We don't do a very good job of that either, both self-care and caring for each other. So we're going to talk a little about what grief is, but a trigger warning. If there is anyone who is in the throes of grief or is experiencing loss, we're going to be talking about loss. So I just want you to know that you might feel. That's okay. That's what grief is. You're allowed to feel. But if there's anybody who needs extra time, I'd be happy to spend a little with you afterwards. So just let me know that, all right? Megan Devine, one of my favorite authors, and I've read many. There are many people who write about grief. Very few of them write about grief the way I understand it. Megan Devine, one of the best authors I've read so far, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, is one that I will quote often because I find her, she's just real. She's very real. One of my favorite quotes is, "We are a culture of emotionally stunted individuals who are scared of mortality and have mastered the concept of stuffing our pain. Western society has created a neat little grief box where we place the grieving and wait for them to emerge whole again." That's kind of where I've started. Just a little bit about my story. I retired from a long career. My husband had already retired, and we had these great plans to do all kinds of wonderful things in our retirement. We were both young, energized, physically fit, and then he died. Pretty suddenly. Kind of turned my world upside down. So then began my journey, and my journey was one of lots of struggles, lots of changes, all of the stuff of grief that we're going to be talking about. I went through a lot of it alone. I didn't have a lot of support. I had just retired. I hadn't established my new posse yet of friends and supports in my other world. So all of this was done with my own discernment, my own learning, my own scrounging around for resources and supports. So I have lived this, just so you know, all right? So the grief box that Megan Devine talks about is really the set of expectations of how our culture defines what grief is supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like, sound like, how long it's supposed to last, what's acceptable, what's not, what we want to have at our dinner table on Thanksgiving and what we don't. There are many who talk about the stages of grief. You've heard of those, right? There aren't any. Get rid of them. There are no stages of grief. The stages that they refer to are Kubler-Ross, the author who talked about death and dying, and the stages of death and dying, and somewhere along the line, somebody attached them to the grieving process. So what is going on in people's minds is that we are supposed to go through these stages of denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance and guilt. And then when you don't go through those stages in a nice orderly fashion like that, you think, I'm doing it wrong. Wait a minute. Or other people will tell you, you're in the stage of anger. You say, well, only today. Yesterday I wasn't. So no, there are no stages. Grief is messy. Grief is all of those things at any given point in time, many multiple things in one day. It's a whole lot. So what is grief? Grief is a response to loss. Grief is mostly about love. If you have loved and lost, you will grieve. The depth of your grief is the depth of your love. It's the flip side of the coin. That's the reality. Love and grief are two sides of the same coin. And why people struggle with grief? Well, if you've experienced someone who has experienced grief, if you have been with someone who's experienced grief, or if you have, you might be able to relate to some of this. The cultural expectations. Well, first of all, we're never prepared for grief, right? There's no way to plan for it, there's no way to prepare for it. Even people who are sitting bedside of somebody who's in a long, slow decline, and we know that death is coming, you still can't prepare for grief. You don't know what that train feels like. It just hits you. So, grief is not something we get over. Has anybody heard those words? It's time for you to move on. Time for you to get over it. How long is grief supposed to last?
Long as it takes.
That's it. Grief never ends. I talk about grief like something you carry. Megan says, some things cannot be fixed. They can only be carried. Grief must be carried. Initially, grief is like that big suitcase you take to the airport that you have to have on wheels because it's so heavy you can't lift it up. And you're just dragging it behind you, and it's so heavy. But over time, it becomes lighter. You still have it. Eventually, it becomes like a backpack. And you carry it on your back. You're never without it. You always have it. It's always there. And you know what? I never want to be without my backpack, because you know what that is? That's my love. That's my attachment. If I didn't have my grief, that means my love is gone. I want that little piece of it. I don't want it to interfere with my daily life anymore, but I want that little piece of it. So know that grief never ends. Our culture, though, puts some arbitrary time frames on grief. What do we know? What do we hear? A year?
A year.
2 years sometimes? Yeah. But we know that's not true. Our culture also suggests that grief is like an illness, like it needs treatment, like you need to get better. It's something that needs to be fixed, something you need to recover from. All of those words suggest that there's something wrong with us, right? No. Grief is not an illness. Grief does not mean you are broken. Grief is just a part of life. But when we don't recover, in the cultural terms, in a certain period of time, when we want to talk about our loved one at an open gathering, when we haven't moved on as someone thinks we should, we're told we're doing it wrong. I had a dear friend who was convinced she was having a mental breakdown because her grief was so intense for months after the sudden death of her husband. And friends were telling her, you need to be in therapy. You need to be in therapy. So she went because she trusted her friends, only to find out that therapy wasn't helping her. She wasn't broken. What she needed was to be seen. She needed to be acknowledged. She needed to be around others who were having similar experiences, who could validate her. And that's when she started to heal. So what I hope you will gain from this time together is just a different perspective, to examine our relationship with loss, our love, our heartbreak, and our sense of community about this whole thing. If we can understand the true nature of grief, we might start to be more helpful, we might be more supportive, and we might change how we talk about grief. And we might make some things better for others who are entering this journey. So why are we so uncomfortable with grief and death talk? Some people don't even like to say the word died. My husband died. Did you hear me say that? I said that. I didn't say he passed. I didn't say I lost him. I said he died. Some people are uncomfortable with language like that. Why? Why are we uncomfortable?
It's uncomfortable.
Why?
People can't deal with it. They don't understand it.
Yeah, people don't understand
And
death.
they don't really want to hear about it.
They don't want to hear about it. But why not? Why do you think that is?
Fear.
Fear? What are we afraid of? That we might catch it. If we talk about death, we're inviting it, right? If we talk about death, it might come knocking at our door. All kinds of superstitions about it. But death is a reality, yeah.
I think also there's fear of if you talk to someone about death, you don't feel comfortable or prepared to help them.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. And that's a reality, right? What do I do? What do I say? And that's next week. We're gonna, no. That's very good. Because we say the stupidest things. Oh, we all do. Oh, we all do. So yeah, we're gonna talk about that, about what not to say. Okay. Please don't tell me it's part of God's plan, please. No. So, let's talk about grief. So I said grief does not flow in predictable linear stages. Nope. Nope. Grief is messy, and this is very important. We all do grief differently. Every single person, you can't compare your grief experience to another. If anybody has been through grief, and somebody has come to you and said, I know what you're going through. No, they don't. Or they start telling you their story of grief, not the same as yours. You can't relate to it. So the reality of grief is that everything changes. Once you have somebody in your life that you have lost, everything changes. Your world turns upside down. The grieving process is not just grieving the loss of this person, but the change of your entire life. Your identity, who am I if I'm not a wife? Who am I if I'm not a daughter, a caregiver, a brother, sister, a parent? It's a loss of a future. All of that changes. How we structure our days, how we grocery shop. I went to the grocery store several weeks after my husband died. I was halfway through the grocery store and looked in my cart and realized I had a bunch of his stuff in there. I left the cart, walked out of the store. said, we'll have to try this again some other day. And that's not a unique experience. My widows talk about that. That, oh, grocery shopping was the hardest. But how we spend our time after we lost somebody. The people we associate with now. Couples may not be able to invite that single person into their group anymore. It all changes. So the loss is not just about this one thing. It's huge. The dynamics are sudden and they're drastic. Maybe there were some shared responsibilities and now they all fall on you. Grief is not something we move on from. We can't avoid it. We can't stuff it. And there's nothing wrong with it. If we're going to experience this grief as a part of love, we need to talk about it in real terms. There's people who are embarrassed to show their emotions in public. My sister, after she lost her husband suddenly, she hibernated for 4 months because she was afraid she was going to cry. I could not drag her out of her house because she was afraid she was going to cry. Every time we talked on the phone and she started crying, she hung up. I said, oh honey, just keep talking. Just keep talking. There's others who don't want to see your emotions.
Well, that's true.
There were many family gatherings I went to when nobody would say my husband's name.
Oh.
They wouldn't say his name because they were afraid they were going to make me cry. Don't want to remind this person. You think I'm forgetting because you're not mentioning his name? So grief is a reality of love. You're going to hear me say that over and over again because I want that to be instilled in you. It's not an illness to be managed, to be cured, or to be treated. You don't need to be fixed. There is a program out there called the Grief Recovery Program. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. John, easy last name, like Smith or something, I can't remember. Anyway, I went to his program because he was offering this certification in grief counseling or something, and I was horrified because his whole program is based on the fact that you need to get over it. I went, oh, let me step out of this room quietly. No, not the model that I want to be projecting. So your experience of grief is not what anybody else can guess.
That's right.
Nobody knows what you're going through, but you can't expect them to either. So that's another point of it. But put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that next week. People do want you to feel better. They really do want to help you, but they just don't know how, right? So grief will affect you in all 5 aspects of your being. Physical. You will be tired, you will lose your appetite, or you will gain your appetite. There will be weight changes. Cognitive. Brain fog. Serious brain fog. Forgetfulness. Emotional. Emotions of grief are all over the place. If you have ever experienced grief, you can probably list some. What are some emotions that you experienced during grief?
Shock.
Shock?
Angry.
Pardon?
Angry.
Angry. Very angry. Oh, that's a big one, right? Yeah. And what did you say?
Sad.
Sadness. Yeah. Guilt? Feeling lost?
Relief.
Relief? That's
Longing.
longing. And guilt because you're feeling relief. That's a huge one, right? Regret. I didn't finish what I was saying. I didn't share my last thing with them. And then social. How to re-engage with the world when you no longer have that same identity that you once had. How to deal with friends and family who don't come around anymore and who don't invite you out. How to manage being alone. And spiritual. Where is God in all of this? Well, let me just say, put the record straight there, God is in every single piece of this, right? God never, ever, ever leaves your side. God carries you through this. Doesn't make it better, but at least you know you're not alone. Your grief will probably hurt more before it hurts less. Yeah, just when you think it's over, you get that grief attack. Anybody know what a grief attack is?
Just all of a sudden.
Yep.
It's your, bam.
Bam. And it's no trigger. Or at least you don't necessarily know what it is. You could be driving down the road. Boom, grief attack. You could be watching TV. Boom. And you try to think, what caused this? I had a grief attack at one point. I was walking through a department store and I came in through the men's shoe department. And the smell of men's shoes, I had to walk back out again and take a minute. I said, oh, that was kind of weird. Grief attacks, they just happen. Knowing that they happen, so you know they happen to other people. When you have friends and all of a sudden they melt, they're turned into a puddle, they're having a grief attack, right?
I was thinking of something. When you know the person can't get better, and you know that they're suffering so much that you can't even touch them. They have such terrible pain. You can't hug them or anything. You want the suffering to go away. So then you have to tell the person, it's not that I want you to go, but I don't want you to suffer anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of takes some of the, so then when you know that the person has been relieved, I didn't feel guilt
Mm-hmm.
because I thought that would be selfish to want him to still continue to live just because I wanted him to live.
That's right. You can feel, and I think earlier you said, you can feel relief. There can be some relief as part of grief.
I felt guilty for the relief. I felt lonesome. I missed him because I loved him very much.
Right.
So we were separated and married. But I didn't ask for him where he gave me everything he had.
When people are suffering, and we know that they're going to die, we do sometimes feel relief when they are finally relieved from this suffering, especially if we are people of faith and we know what's coming next, right? My brother had Alzheimer's, and he had that long, slow decline from Alzheimer's, and when it got to the point where he couldn't care for himself and he couldn't stay in his home because we couldn't care for him, he graciously went pretty quickly. He didn't stay in a facility but for a few days, and he died. And my sister-in-law and I both share relief.
Yeah.
We are sad, we miss him, but we miss the other him,
Yes.
right? Right?
Yes.
We are so relieved that he is no longer in that confusion and agony and pain. So yes, but that is also part of grief. We are still sad, and we experience so many other things. So the other thing to consider in terms of why grief is unique, and I'll walk through a few of these quickly, is the relationship you had with the person, how close they were in your life, how present they were in your life. Is it somebody who was in your house every day and interacted with, or is it somebody that you saw once in a while? What is the impact that they had? What was the attachment you had to that person? The circumstances of the death. How and why the person died. Is it a point of relief of suffering? Was it sudden? Was it unexpected? Was it traumatic? Were you present? Were there other people involved? Circumstances of death affect our grief. And other people in your life. While your grief is uniquely yours, You shouldn't have to do it alone. You need to enlist the support of others. You need to ask for what you need because people don't know. And we're going to talk more about that next week, how to do that. And then your unique personality. How would you describe yourself? How would others describe you? Are you a person who can understand emotions and can name them and say, here's what's I'm going through, I get it, okay, I'm going into a panic attack, I know what I have to do? Or are you a person who's sort of just free-floating and says, I have no idea what's going on with me and I think I'm going crazy? Any of the above might be true. That's all part of why grief is different for everybody. Was the person that died responsible for many of the activities in your life? Do your finances change now because that person's gone? Do you have to move? Do you have to give up your home? Was that person half of your income? All of those things complicate grief. Your culture, your spiritual background, your emotional health, your intelligence, all of those things affect how you understand grief, how you manage your grief. In hospice, I will tell you my experience has been very consistently people who are loved and people who have faith go through the transition from life to death gracefully and smoothly. People who do not have love, people who do not have family, people who do not have faith struggle in those last days and weeks. So there's something to be said for our faith and how it helps us through those days. So your physical health and your independence, was that person a caregiver? And that loss is going to now change your life. So grief is also cumulative. If you've had other losses in your life, there's a compounding effect, especially if you didn't manage the grief earlier. It just kind of keeps adding up. I know when my husband died, I just kept thinking of my mother. I went, oh, didn't finish. Still have my mother's grief going on. So we're going to talk more about emotions of grief next week because it's important to understand that for your own self-care and things that you can do for yourself. The one thing I say over and over again to everybody, though, is say their name. Say their name. Tell your story. Say their name. Continue to do the things you did with your loved one, for your loved one. That's okay. That's okay. But say their name. You can be selfish during grief. It's your time. I tell some of my friends who are trying to be considerate, I say, play the grief card. You got a couple years. People let you play it. Play the grief card. It's okay. Be selfish. Say no. I don't want to go. Or I have to leave. Those are all self-care things we will talk more about. You have to be good to yourself. Mostly remember, you will feel better. It is all temporary, but you will never go back to the way it was. Grief changes your world, it changes your life, and it changes you. But hopefully it changes you for the better, because the depth of that experience creates in you the ability to see things differently. Several of my friends have told me that since they have lost, they are more compassionate. They recognize needs in others that they never saw before. And I'd like to think that that is a positive thing that can come from grief. So I'm going to stop talking now. Our time is kind of up. But does anybody have any questions for me about grief? And this is part 1. It's a teaser for part 2. Yeah?
How do you care for the people who are left behind? friend of mine, his wife of 40 years, my friend, went through a terrible year and died. And I don't know him very well. I just knew her. But I can tell he has need. I took lots of soup and food and everything to him. But at some point that's got to stop. So then I don't want him to feel forgotten. What can I do for this person I hardly know?
And for a person you hardly know, that's interesting. But I will always say ask. Ask. Ask how you can help. You can't guess. I want to stay in your life. I want to stay connected. I want to do something. Tell me what you need. And likewise, you need to ask for what you need as well. People can't guess that. If you're sitting there alone on your couch watching reruns of Friends, it's because somebody out there doesn't know that you need company right now. And I bet you there's somebody who'd love to come over and sit and watch Friends with you. Anything else? All right, thank you all for being here today. I would like to read one of my favorite authors before we go, John O'Donohue, Irish priest who does a lot of writing of blessings and poetry. And this is one of his on grief. When you lose someone you love, your life becomes strange. The ground beneath you gets fragile. Your thoughts make your eyes unsure, and some dead echo drags your voice down where words have no confidence. Your heart has grown heavy with loss, and though this loss has wounded others too, no one knows what has been taken from you when the silence of absence deepens. Flickers of guilt kindle regret for all that was left unsaid or undone. There are days when you wake up happy, again inside the fullness of life, until the moments break and you are thrown back onto the black tide of loss. Days when you have your heart back, you are able to function well, until in the middle of work or encounter, suddenly with no warning, you are ambushed by grief. It becomes hard to trust yourself. All you can depend on is that sorrow will remain faithful to itself. More than you, it knows its way and will find the right time to pull and pull the rope of grief until that coiled hill of tears has reduced to its last drop. Gradually, you will learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed one. And when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from that gap in the air and be able to enter the hearth in your soul where your loved one has awaited your return all the time. Go in peace. See you next week.
Thank you.